We're going to do, at least for those of you that are used to coming to my talk, something different today. This will be less of a lecture, more of a study group. We're going to study some Torah together. And what I've picked to study with you is perhaps one of the most difficult stories of the Torah. It's got drama to it. It's got confusion to it. There's an element of hurt. There's triumph. But there are a lot of questions. A lot of questions. And for most of the book of Genesis, we're focusing on stories. The Torah talks to us by way of stories. And these stories have a way of connecting to us because we put our lives into the characters and we become part of the story. So when a story troubles us, or where there's many questions on the story, it gives us time to stop and reflect and say, what is the message? What's being said to us here? So we're going to focus today on the binding of Isaac. We'll attempt to understand it, to analyze it, not just the tale of the story, but why is this story so fundamental to Judaism that it's repeated every single day in our prayers, with no day left out. If you have prayers this morning, we said the Akeda. Tomorrow morning, we will say the Akeda. Rosh Hashanah, we're going to read the Akeda. It's so central to Judaism. So we find that Abraham wasn't just tested this one time. In fact, we're told that he was tested 10 times. Asora Nisyonos, Abraham was challenged and tested 10 times. V'amad bekulam, he passed every single test. So before we analyze the binding of Isaac, let's first understand the meaning of the word test. What does it mean God tested Abraham? Any of you in this room teachers? Okay. You test your students, right? Every once in a while there's an exam. Why do you do that? What's the reason for the test? To see if your message is getting across, to see how they're doing, to see what the student knows. Or for a good teacher, to see the effectiveness of their teaching. Are they doing a good job? Not necessarily only are the students learning, but am I effective in my method of teaching? Do I need to change? Because if every kid in the class flunks the test, maybe there's something wrong with the way I'm teaching. To challenge the student. During regular type work every day, the kid may be paying attention, but suddenly comes test time. Oh, you got everyone's attention. They're going to focus more. So it motivates the students. To compare students to see which of the students are the stronger students, which of the students need a little more of attention. So we monitor the progress of the students. That's what we use that word test for. So if we use that simple explanation of the word test, most of these explanations will make little sense when it comes to God, quote unquote, testing Abraham. Because God knows all. And if God knows Abraham, and if God knows the future of Abraham, why test him? He knows everything before. Why put him through it, especially when we deal with a quote-unquote test such as the binding of Isaac, when there is tremendous pain involved? Why put Abraham through this if you know the result anyway? Perhaps we can have a better understanding if we look at the Hebrew word used here, which we translate into English test. And I'll keep using that English translation, but let's look at the Hebrew word. Because the Hebrew word is nisayon. Ve'elokim nisa es Avraham, from the word nes. Nes is a pole. A pole stands up high. A pole can be seen from a distance. Nes is also used to describe a flag, a banner. Same idea, a flag pole, which you put a flag on top of the pole so that people see, people identify. It's visible. People can recognize it from afar. Countries put up their flags to make a statement of this is the property of this country. People see the flag, it means something. The Nisayon is not a test here that exists for the tester. It wasn't for God's sake. It wasn't for God to know. God knew. Let's take a look at chapter 18, verse 17. I see the papers are a little bit out of order, but if you jump to text number 2 on page number 5. And God said, shall I conceal from Abraham what I'm about to do? Let me set the scene for you. This is taking place when God is sending the 3 angels disguised as human beings. One was to visit Abraham. This was after circumcision. And the other angels are going on to destroy Sodom. They're going to wipe out Sodom. Suddenly, the narrative of the Torah changes. And the narrative of the Torah does something it very rarely does. It has the author of the Bible talking to himself. The author of the Bible, most of the times, is third person, and it's speaking to the audience. In these verses, he's not speaking to the audience, he's speaking to himself. See the text. And God said, to whom? To himself. Shall I conceal from Abraham what I'm about to do? And Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. What are the next words? For I know him. This is before the binding of Isaac takes place. God already let us know that he to himself said, I know him. If God knows Abraham, it means he knows everything about Abraham's past, present, and future. He knows him in the godly sense, in the infinite sense. There's nothing about Abraham that he does not know. I know he will command his children and his household after him that they keep the ways of Hashem, doing charity and justice, in order that Hashem might bring upon Abraham that which he had spoken of him. I know this guy is perfect. I know he's going to succeed in the mission. I know he's going to do everything I ask, and I know that there will forever, eternally be a Jewish people, descendants of Abraham, and they will always carry on the mission. I know, says God. Not I hope, not I believe, I know. So if God knows, why test him? If God knows, why challenge him? If God knows already before, he told us he knows. God already revealed to us, the students of the Bible, how he felt about Abraham before the story of the binding of Isaac takes place. He tells us that. So if you know him, why test him? The answer is that the test is not for God's knowledge. It's not for God's benefit. It's for Abraham's benefit. It's for our benefit. And it's for the world's benefit. And that's what we're going to discover as we go through. Many latent potentials are never actualized unless they're tested. Some of us may have talents and skills within us, but we have no idea that we actually had them. Some of us could be artists, but we have no idea that we have the gift of art. Some of us could have been great baseball players had only our parents sent us to Little League when we were young. I could have been the third baseman of the New York Yankees. Could have been. But there are talents, there are potentials that are within us that unless it's put into practice, we may never know what we had. And when do we know? When we push ourselves. When we go to that soccer club, or we go to that art school, or we go to the music school, or we take piano lessons over and over and over, when we push ourselves to the limit, when we face the demands of a test, a challenge. In order for Abraham to succeed at his mission, he needed to have been brought min hakoach el hapoel, from potential to actual. God knew the potential of Abraham, and God knew that anything he was going to ask Abraham to do, he was going to do. But did Abraham know? Did Abraham know what he was made of? Did he know the strength of his own faith? Would have his children known the strength of his own faith if it was never actualized? Only us as the children would be able to receive the strength of Abraham if Abraham actually showed that strength, lived that strength, had to practice through this, and actually had to go through the actual challenge. And we'll get more on this theme as we go along. Let's go to text number 3, page number 6. God will test the righteous one, Rabbi Yonason said, when the linen maker beats the flax, he does not beat the weakened flax too much, lest it split. But when the flax is of high quality, he beats it more to make it finer. So God does not test the wicked, who are not able to withstand it. He brings the high quality of the righteous through their life experiences, which allows them to maximize their potential. Text number 4 from Pirkei Avot. Our father Abraham was tested 10 times, and we withstood them all to indicate how great was Abraham's love for God. Text number 5. These are the 10 trials of Abraham. So I want to go through quickly with you the actual 10 trials. We say the binding of Isaac was the 10th. We're going to quickly go through 8. We're going to slow down at number 9 and then get back to number 10. So let's go through them. And again, this is a class that I usually do over a 3-part series. I'm trying to condense it into 60 minutes today. Otherwise, you're going to be for dessert at lunch. So let me just try to go through these 10 tests quickly. The first test takes place before God even reveals himself to Abraham, before the story of Lech Lecha takes place. King Nimrod threatens to kill Abraham by throwing him into a furnace because Abraham refuses to bow to his idols. Nimrod presents himself as the God. Abraham says, you're not the God. Nimrod says, bow. He says, I won't bow. If you don't bow, I'll throw you into a furnace. Says Abraham, go ahead and do so. Abraham is thrown into the furnace. He prefers to die rather than betray his belief in the creator of the universe. A miracle of miracle, Abraham comes out of the fiery furnace alive. So this test takes place early on in the life of Abraham. It's noteworthy that these early challenges take place before there's any communication between God and Abraham. It is purely on faith that there's a God. God didn't say, Abraham, don't you bow. Abraham, let him throw you into a fire. He does that on his own. And he comes to a realization that there are things worth dying for. Life without certain ideals is not living at all, and for a Jew, life without God, without faith, denies life its meaning. Test number 2. God comes to Abraham and he's asked, Lech Lecha, he's asked to leave his land, his family, his friends, and to wander to a strange land. Anyone ever read Thomas Cahill's book, The Gift of the Jews? A wonderful book. Thomas Cahill establishes that the most powerful words in all of literature are 2 words, Lech Lecha. When God comes to Abraham and says, leave, Lech Lecha, go for you, that changed the world forever. Everything changes with 2 words. And this is a non-Jew coming to that conclusion. These 2 words, the greatest 2 words ever said in all of literature. Lech Lecha, Abraham is sent on a mission. This trial taught Abraham that to have a close relationship with God, a unique one, he must be prepared to leave behind his comfort zone. The comfort zone is the place of your birth. The comfort zone is your parents' house. That's your comfort zone. When you're sent out of that comfort zone, there's challenges, there's anxiety, there's stress. You don't know. The unknown is challenging for a human being. God says Abraham is asked to leave his land, his family, his friends, and to wander to a strange land. His natural tendencies, his habits, his preconceived perceptions, he has to leave it all behind. He has to be a stranger in a strange land. But it is his relationship with God that he seeks more than anything else. So if God says go, he goes. Test number 3, page number 7. Abraham trusts God and ventures on an unspecified journey which culminates in his arrival to the land of Canaan. But as soon as he arrives, a famine breaks out in the land before he even has a chance to settle. He's forced to wander to another land. God comes to him in the first communication and says, this is where I want you to go. Finally, Abraham heard from the God that he risked his life for. And what does God say? Leave, go, where? To the land that I will show you. And he makes his way to the land of Canaan. He makes his way to the promised land. And as soon as he arrives there, guess what? Headlines of the newspaper, there's no food, there's a famine. We have nothing for you to eat. This is where God told me to come. This is the promised land. There is an expectation. And we all have these expectations, and I'll give it to you soon in a very simple example. That when we're on a mission from God, when we're doing what God asked us to do, which involves sacrifice, that everything's going to go smoothly. That there'll be no obstacles, there'll be no struggles, only goodness and kindness on this encounter, because after all, I'm doing it for God. We would expect as Jews, since God took us to Sinai and gave us 613 commandments and told us he wants us to be a light unto the nation, that he tells us he wants us to be a priest to the world, that he would have to then take care of us. It only makes sense. If you want me to be a light unto the nation, you want me to be a priest to all the nations, then pay my salary. Take care of me. We should all be living in Israel, praying and studying all day and giving lectures to the world how to be good, how to be ethical, teach them the Noahide laws. What a shock it must have been to the Jews in the wilderness when Moses starts telling them, and when you plow your field. Plow what field? On and on and on. They're being told commandments, Orla and Peah and Leket and Meiser and Truma. They're beginning to understand that it's not what they envisioned. There's going to be work involved. We're going to have careers as well and be a light unto the nations. We were in for a major surprise. And if we thought that the world will fall in love with us because we're their teacher, wow, were we in for a surprise. How do we act? We react when things don't go as planned. Do we drop the mission? I had a couple. They were already past, they had children and grandchildren, and they decided to coming to classes, and they started studying week after week after week. First 1 class a week, then 2 classes. They were both retired. They were coming to 5 classes a week. They were literally living in the Chabad house, coming to every possible class. And they didn't live within walking distance of the shul. And after years of this, at one point, the woman says, I've decided that I'd like to keep Shabbos. They didn't live in Agura. They lived in Northridge. And they lived quite a few miles from the young Israel of Northridge. And she decided she's going to walk to shul. That Shabbos is going to be her first Shabbos of being totally Shomer Shabbos. She's going to make the long walk to shul. She has to do it. And on Thursday, before this big Shabbos, she's walking outside her house. She falls and she breaks her leg. And she calls me from the hospital. She said, I don't understand God. I was doing this for him. After years of contemplating, years of thinking through the sacrifice that it was going to take to go Shomer Shabbos, this week he lets me break my leg? After the cast, after everything is removed, finally, again, the big Shabbos, that next Shabbos that she was going to make that first walk, a thunderstorm like you've never seen. And she calls, I don't understand. I am doing this for God. Why is he making it so difficult? And the response was, he loves you. If it was all easy, if it was all just a beautiful spring day, then it's easy. He wants to see, do you really have this relationship with him? Can you go to the land of Canaan because I asked you to go and see a hunger in the land and not turn to me and say, what are you doing? I'm doing this for you. So that challenge we all face every time we do a mitzvah, and it's hard, and we're let down. How do we react? How do we respond? Because our expectation, and to be honest, my expectation, every one of us expectations, when we're on a mission to do something for God, we expect smooth sailing. And yet it doesn't always happen. Test number 4, it gets even worse. So what does he do? He has to go down to Egypt to get food. And what happens there? Pharaoh abducts his wife Sarah. So Abraham goes down to Egypt to get food because he's forced to, and his wife Sarah is taken by Pharaoh. Now, we're going to see a pattern, and again, we won't be able to have the time to get into it, but Maaseh, Avos, Simon, Labanim, everything that takes place to the patriarchs in the book of Genesis will eventually happen to the descendants later on in the book of Exodus. So the idea of going into Egypt, being taken prisoner, so to say, by Pharaoh, it will play itself out in the book of Exodus as well. And just like Sarah will leave the house of Pharaoh with many gifts, the Jewish people will ultimately leave Egypt with many, many gifts. Challenge number 5, test number 5. Upon hearing of the capture of his nephew Lot, Abraham is faced with the choice of risking his life by going to war, vastly outnumbered against a group of powerful kings, it should say, and their armies, or leaving his nephew to his fate. And he will choose to fight for his nephew. Lot, to his nephew, who did not wish to follow the teachings of Abraham, nevertheless, it still brings out this compassion in his uncle, and Abraham is off to a war vastly outnumbered. Challenge number 6, in a vision, God reveals to Abraham the exile and the persecution of his descendants, known as the Brit Bein Habsarim. God shows him what's going to happen to his descendants and shows him all the exiles. He will also show him the redemption. He will also show him the Geula. He will show him Mashiach's times, but he will see the pain and the suffering and every exile that we've been through. Abraham got a visual of it. That's extremely painful for a Zayda to have to see what his grandchildren are going to go through, and yet we don't find Abraham rebelling, quitting, complaining. Challenge number 7, God commands Abraham to circumcise himself at the age of 99. The first thought that could have gone through to Abraham's mind, there could have been a lot. But knowing the character of Abraham, the first thought should have been, what will the neighbors say? Why is that such an important question? Abraham is busy inviting people in. He's into teaching people monotheism. He's into teaching people about God. So if he wants people to fall in love with God, circumcision at age 99 may be a little bit of a problem over there. If you read text number 6 from Hayom Yom, when my father was 4 or 5 years old, he went to his grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek, on Shabbat, Vayera, and he began to cry, and he said, why did God show himself to our father Abraham, but he didn't show himself to us? And the Tzemach Tzedek answered him, when a tzaddik decides at the age of 99 years that he should be circumcised, he deserves that God should appear to him. Abraham passes through test number 7. Test number 8 comes. Abimelech abducts Sarah. Similar to trial number 4 with Pharaoh abducting Sarah, but this one is closer to home. Gerar was a neighboring land. It was considered already the lawful people, the sophisticated people. And if this is the sophisticated people, the neighbors upon which I live, and they're kidnapping my wife, oy vey, where did God send me to live? Egypt, I understand, but God didn't ask me to live in Egypt. He asked me to live here. And this is how these inhabitants behave. These are the people that I'm being asked to influence. What are my chances of success? Number 9, and I said we're going to slow down on number 9. God instructs Abraham to listen to his wife Sarah and expel his son Ishmael from the house. This story is going to be very important for us to having a complete understanding of number 10 of the binding of Isaac. Abraham and Sarah do not have any children, at least not yet. Sarah had a maid named Hagar. Sarah reasons, why should Abraham go through life childless? After all, God keeps saying you're going to be the father of a new nation, the father of a new nation. If you're going to be the father of the new nation, obviously there needs to be a child in this nation. Otherwise, what's next? And if this new nation has to change the world, then this child is critically important. I'm not having children. I'm already up there in years. Biologically, physically, I can't have any more children. I can't have any children. So she comes up with the surrogate mother plan. She says, marry my maid, and if she gives birth, I will raise the child. Abraham listens to his wife, and indeed, Hagar gets pregnant. But the moment Hagar got pregnant, she stopped seeing herself as the maid of Sarah and started looking at herself as the worthy wife of Abraham. He's married to her all these years, and she doesn't get pregnant. He's married to me just for a few weeks, and I'm pregnant. Obviously, I'm the more worthy wife. And she starts disrespecting Sarah, who made this great sacrifice. And conflict breaks out between the two women, between Sarah and Hagar. And Hagar finds herself in the presence of Sarah, and Sarah is not being so pleasant to her, and she runs away from home, and she's met by an angel, and she's told to return and live under Sarah, show respect to Sarah. The angel also promises that the son that will be born will multiply greatly, incidentally, will always be involved in conflict. These are the things the angel already said while she was pregnant. She goes back. She gives birth to a son. The son's name we all know is Ishmael. Years later, 13 years later, Abraham is promised by God that he and Sarah will give birth to a son. Now, that means for 13 years, Abraham believed this is the guy. All those promises about light unto the nations, eternal blessings to all the families on the face of the earth, this is the guy. This is my child. So now God comes to him 13 years later and says, no, Sarah's going to give birth to a child, and that's going to be the child that will carry forth the mission. Abraham's initial response is, Lu Yishmael Yichya Lifanecha. Oh, that Ishmael should walk before you. The first thought in Abraham's mind was, Ishmael is no good. I didn't raise Ishmael properly. He's going off on the wrong path. And the first cry of a father to God is, please, don't dislike Ishmael. What's wrong with Ishmael? And he believed that the reason God was promising another son was because this one struck out. And God reassures him that it was never the plan. It was never going to be Ishmael. It was always going to be a son that would be miraculously born by Sarah. Let's jump a year later. Sarah gives birth to a miraculous child at the age of 90 years old. Abraham was 100 years old. They named the child Isaac, Yitzchak. Yitzchak means laughter. As the children are growing up, Sarah sees Ishmael as a bad influence on young Isaac. And what does she do? She asks Abraham to send him away with Hagar. I don't want Hagar living here anymore. I don't want Ishmael living here anymore. We have our son. We have the successor. We have the individual that will bring forth the continuation of this new mission to the world of changing the world for the better. Ishmael is going to get in the way of this. Ishmael is going to be a bad influence. And Abraham is pained by the request because he loves his son. Through and through, you will always find Abraham loves his son. So God comes in and God says to Abraham, listen to these words, "Be not distressed over the youth or your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you to do, listen to her voice." The women in this audience love that verse. They love it. Whatever she says, you listen. She's right. Since it is Isaac that will be your offspring. She's making logical sense. You need to protect Isaac right now. He's growing up. He's got an important mission. He needs to be protected. Having Ishmael live in the same house is not healthy. The mom knows what she's talking about. She's the protector of her son, and you're going to need to step aside, Abraham, and listen to her, because her words are clear and her words are correct. But as for the son of your maid, as far as you're concerned as a tati of Ishmael, I will also make him into a nation since he is your offspring. You don't have to worry about Ishmael. I'll take care of him too. So you don't have to lose sleep. I'll take care of him. But listen to Sarah. I'm going to come back again to this story. Just remember where we're leaving it. And then test number 10. So test number 9 was that God confirms with Sarah, send away your son, and that's difficult for Abraham. But he does it. Test number 10, God instructs Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice to him. Let's just go to tape now number 2, back to page number 2, text number 1. We're going to read through a little bit of the binding of Isaac. I'm just going to read through it quickly. This is the famous binding of Isaac. So time afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favorite son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, you stay here with the ass, and the boy and I will go up there, and we will worship, and we will return to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone, the knife, and the 2 walked off together. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, So he said to his father, Abraham, father, and he answered, yes, my son. And he said, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? For those who remember the vernacular of the 1980s, where's the beef? Anyone remember what I'm talking about? Anybody? Okay, that was a good commercial. And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And if you look closely at the words, it's God will select, lo, haseh, you, to be the sheep, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. They continued. Isaac figured it out. He understood what was happening. They arrived at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Is anyone that's still in suspense, or you all know the end of the story? Then an angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, he answered, here I am. And he said, do not raise your hand against the boy, do anything for him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favorite one, from me. When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham named the site Hashem Yireh, whence the present saying, on the mountain of the Lord there is vision. The angel of the Lord called out to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this, have you not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessings upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. And all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command. The Talmud says, God says, please take your son. Please. Kach no. God pleaded with Abraham, please, just one more test. Says the Talmud, God is saying, I tested you with 9 tests. Please pass this one test more so that people will not say that the previous test didn't prove your devotion to me. God's not saying that directly to Abraham. God's saying that to us. That this test was so important that if Abraham would not have passed this test, the other 9 would have not proved anything. So clearly this test becomes the test of them all. As we mentioned, the binding of Isaac is not only a pivotal part of Abraham's life, but a significant event of Jewish history, affecting the lives of each and every single Jew. As I mentioned, we repeat it every single day. It's referred to over and over by the sages in the Talmud, by the Amoraim, by the Rishonim, by the Acharonim, by the Mefarshim. Any Jewish commentator, any Jewish author on any Jewish subject will always come back to the story of the binding of Isaac. Why? Why is it given such prominence? Getting back to the question that I opened with. Why do we say in the prayer that we recite right after reading this, we say, Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, just as Abraham, our father, suppressed his compassion for his only son to do your will with his whole heart, so may your compassion suppress your wrath against us, and may your mercy prevail over your attribute of stern justice. We open our prayers by saying, and because of that story, anything I'm going to ask you for today, God, please grant, because Abraham did this. We also know that after the binding of Isaac takes place, for the remaining 38 years of Abraham's life, he was never tested again. This was it. This was the ultimate height. This was the epitome, how high a human being can climb. So I want to go over 4 questions with you and then 4 answers. Question number 1. The same question, why was this test more difficult than any of the prior 9 tests that Abraham experienced? Question number 2, why do we call it a test for Abraham and not a test for Isaac? After all, Isaac was going to be the sacrifice. Number 3, why the need to repeat the binding of Isaac so often? And question 4, which we also started with, was God not already convinced of Abraham's faith before the binding of Isaac? Didn't Abraham already prove his total emunah, his total faith, his mesirat nefesh, his self-sacrifice? If God knew the outcome, why was it important to put him through this? And the more we look into the binding of Isaac, the more we will see that the binding of Isaac is a test that has many dimensions. And I'm going to show you here 5 dimensions. If you're taking notes, let's start with dimension number 1. Abraham waited for 100 years for the birth of a child with Sarah. 100 years. Remember, this was a great miracle that takes place. And this miracle happens. And the son Isaac is born to Abraham and to Sarah in their old age. A son that God declares is the heir to Abraham. He is the one. God made it very clear. This is the guy. He's your successor. The mission of the Jewish people, which God already told us, is an eternal mission. It's not a temporary. It's not a few decades. It's not a century. It's eternal. Will carry on the shoulders of Isaac. And he will live in the land of Israel. God says he will become a great nation. I will make his name great. He will be a blessing. All of this on the shoulders of Isaac. For 37 years, Isaac was not a little baby boy when the story takes place. He's 37 years old. For 37 years, Isaac is raised and educated by Abraham and Sarah without any influence from the outside. It is clear that Isaac was growing up to be a worthy successor of Abraham. Everything seems to be perfectly fine until God comes to Abraham and says, take your son, the son that you love, take Isaac and bring him to the mountain. With this one statement, Doubt and confusion is brought upon the very future of the Jewish people. How would it continue? Who would lead it? If there would be no Isaac, who would Abraham pass the mission on to? God already excluded Ishmael. He said it won't be him. It will be Isaac. Isaac is not married at 37. Isaac has no children. If he dies on the mountain, yes, this pain for Abraham and Sarah, that's grief. But what about everything we have spoken about until now in the Torah? Everything about this future Jewish people, everything about the promised land. Furthermore, Abraham had already built up a following. The Torah tells us he had many students already. People learned from him. People followed him. He was a respected leader. He gained respect wherever he went. The stories of the Bible leading up to this tell us that. Wherever he went, he was an honored prince. And what were his teachings? What stood out about Abraham? That people should emulate God, he said. God who hates cruelty and loves kindness. Abraham spoke out against the generation that believed in the worshiping of idols, against the generation that believed in human sacrifice. He spoke out against kings and faiths that believe that you take your child and you bring them as a sacrifice to a god. Abraham called it murder. That can't be God. That can't be faith. God is a God of love and of goodness and of kindness. And people started listening to this. It made sense. It felt right. Their souls were bound with Abraham because of this belief. What would happen to all of the followers if indeed he carried out this instruction that God gave him and actually slaughtered his son? They would hear that Abraham violated the very teaching he so strongly preached against. His entire life's work would be nullified and wasted. He would be ridiculed by the entire world. This belief in God as the one moral voice in the world that he, Abraham, worked so hard to teach would have been discredited, perhaps for good. The human being can withstand much pain in life. The most difficult struggle of all is disgrace. When we're disgraced, it becomes very difficult to recover. Abraham must have known that upon his return, disgrace awaited him. Disgrace for Abraham, disgrace for his teachings, and worst of all, a mockery of the God that he worked so hard to introduce to society. And yet for Abraham, there was no doubt, no confusion, no hesitation. He was asked by God to perform a mitzvah, to perform a deed. His love and his awe of God and his desire to fulfill God's command took precedence over all. He could think about nothing else that mattered, just God's commandment. That's dimension number one. Dimension number two. Verse after verse in the portion of Lech Lecha and Vayera tell us that all the promises that God gave to Abraham concerning his descendants. It's filled with promises. It would only be natural for Abraham to wonder what would be with those promises if I carried out the sacrifice. Certainly, Abraham could have said, I'm going to do it. I just have a question, God. But what about, finish the sentence. Who's going to carry on? What about? Who's going to be the light unto the nations? Who's going to do? Just a question. I'm not withholding. I just have a question. What about? It would have been understandable, perhaps expected. And yet, there's total silence from Abraham. Total obedience. Vayashkem Avraham baboker. He got up early in the morning. Vayikach, he took and he went. Abraham understands that listening to God, even if the command is beyond any comprehension whatsoever, is the ultimate in serving God. He will hold nothing back, not his son, not his reputation, not his students, not his lifetime of achievements. It did not matter to Abraham that no one would understand him so long as he was fulfilling the will of God. Dimension number three. We cannot underestimate Isaac's role in the story of the binding of Isaac. After all, it's called the binding of Isaac. He was to be the sacrifice. We find, as we read the verses, Vayelchu shnehem yachdav, the two went together as one. The Afal Pi, Rashi says, and even though Shehaven Yitzchak Shehu Hoylech Lishchat, that Isaac at some point realizes, my father was meticulous. He took the knife, he took the fire, he took the coal, he took everything, the wood, the Aye Haseh, but you didn't take the animal. And he says, Elokim Yirelo Haseh, God will select the offering, my son. Says Rashi, Isaac understood. And yet he still continued with the same enthusiasm that he did a day ago. He knew. Isaac knew very well what was about to happen. So why is this the test of Abraham, not the test of Isaac? The answer is that Isaac was indeed prepared to give up his life, as many Jews throughout history have demonstrated the ultimate sacrifice. Isaac would climb Mount Moriah, but he wouldn't have to descend it. Isaac wouldn't have to answer the world, what have you done with your son? Isaac wouldn't have to face a wife and explain that he slaughtered the son that she waited for so long and loved so much. Isaac wouldn't have to sit in an empty home, empty of guests. He would now refrain. No one would come to this house of hospitality after hearing what Abraham did. Isaac would not have to face a more difficult tomorrow because it would all come to an end today. You see, Isaac was being asked to die as a Jew. Abraham was being asked to live on the day after as a Jew. It would be he that would have to lift the knife to his son. Dimension number 4. We're taught in Hasidus. Each of the patriarchs represented a particular midah, a particular attribute of service to God. Everything about Abraham was the attribute of chesed, kindness. Isaac represented Gevurah, more of severity, of strength. Tiferes meant beauty, which was Jacob. Everything about Abraham was chesed, kindness. He served God with kindness. He served humanity with kindness. Everything was kindness. So that if we go back to test number 9, when Sarah, his wife, says, Goresh ha'oma hazos ve'es bina, I want you to chase away, send away the handmaid and her son. Ki lo yirash ben ha'oma hazos and beniyim Yitzchak, for I don't want them living together with Yitzchak. He will not be the one to inherit with Yitzchak. The Torah tells us, Vayera hadavar ma'od be'enei Avram. This was very distressful to Abraham. Why? He's a man of chesed. He's a father of chesed. He loves his son. And if you're filled with love, if you're a person of love, if everything about you is love, when you hear that you need to do something strict, it's very hard. Very hard. It becomes difficult for him to send his son Ishmael away, even though Sarah had a logical reason for her request. So then God comes along and God instructs him, listen to Sarah, she's right. So even though you're a man of chesed, you're a man of kindness, you now have God coming to you and saying, but this is what you need to do. You have to at this moment act with gevurah, with strength. So he has the assurances of God that it was the right thing. And then God comes, because he's a man of chesed, a man of kindness, says, I know that you worry about your son Ishmael, so I'm telling you, I'll watch over him. I'll protect him. So he gives the man of kindness some peace, some comfort. Listen to your wife. She's making logical sense. It will be good for Isaac, good for Ishmael. The binding of Isaac's story, however, challenged him not only to do something which was incomprehensible, but went against his very essence and the personality of a man of kindness. The reason this was such a difficult challenge is because it went against him. It went against his personality. It went against his very essence. It went against everything Abraham represented and believed in his life. Now I want to go back to one sentence in dimension now number 5. When God introduces this to him, he says, Kach na es bincha, take your son. Then God says, Es yechidcha, your only son. Then he says, Es Yitzchak asher ahavta, the one that you love. And then he says, Es Yitzchak, Yitzchak. He doesn't say, Kach Yitzchak, take Yitzchak. He builds it up. Before we look into what the commentaries say on these words, let's first look again. Let's compare to number 9. Sarah wants Ishmael driven from the house, and that becomes a difficult task. Abraham, it's listed as test number 9 for him. It's listed as a challenge, even though Sarah had a valid, justified reason for wanting Ishmael out of the house. It's considered a challenge for Abraham. Why? Because it went against his chesed, it went against his kindness. God instructs him to listen, that Sarah is correct, Ishmael should be separated. God comforts him and says, I'll take care of Ishmael. In this challenge, no justification is given. You remember, there Sarah gives a reason, a logical reason why Ishmael has to be separated. Now, take Isaac. Why? There's no justification given. No mention of any sin on Isaac's part that deserves death. Ishmael is a bad influence on Isaac. I'm giving you a logical explanation to do something difficult. Okay, I can understand that. So, does God come to Isaac and say, you know what? Isaac stepped out of bounds. Doesn't say that to him. No promise here of the future. Remember, he says, I'll take care of Ishmael. I know it bothers you, but I'll take care of him. Any assurances from God to Abraham, don't worry about the future? Not a word. Does God say, and Sarah will give birth to another miraculous child? Doesn't say that to him. There's no words of comfort to Abraham when this test number 10 comes up. What we find is the very opposite. Kach no es bincha. The commentaries explain, bincha, he's your son, means he is deserving of being called your son because he walks in your footsteps. Es yechidcha, your only son. What is God saying? He's still your only son. He will remain your only son because Sarah is not going to be giving birth to another child. Es yechidcha, this is the only one. And I'm not taking Yishmael back in. Es yechidcha, this is the only son of yours. Then he says, Asher hafta, the one that you love, that deserves your love. And when God comes and says he deserves your love, that even builds the love even higher. You all love your children, but tell me, how did you feel when a teacher of your child called and said, your son is excelling so well in school? I look forward every day to hearing your son's wisdom. His behavior and kindness in class is a model to all. Don't you feel this tremendous love for your kid at that moment? Of course you loved your son 15 minutes before that phone call, but now it has intensified. God comes and says, your only son, the one that you love, the one that deserves your love, the one that's walking in your footsteps. He's building this love for Isaac to the highest of the high. So whereas by Ishmael, God comes and says, you know, Sarah is right. It's not good for him to be together with Isaac. He's a bad influence. He's not growing up properly. Send him away, but I'll take care of him. Look what happens here, the exact opposite. Love him, your only son, walking with your footsteps. He's building it up and building up. There can be no greater nachas that Abraham can have from Isaac that he's having at this very moment until boom. And what should you do with this child that you love so much, that deserves your love, that's going to be your only son forever, for all eternity? Bring him to a mountain and bring him as an offering. With all of the above in mind, we have a better understanding of why the binding of Isaac was indeed the 10th and most difficult test for Abraham, and why there would no longer be a test to his faith once the binding of Isaac was complete. He would have reached the epitome of serving God with what we call total mesirat nefesh, total self-sacrifice. Not only does Abraham not question God when given the instructions, he tells us, Vayashkem Avram Baboker, he got up early in the morning, he saddled his donkey on his own, he went with excitement to fulfill the commandment of God. The Alter Rebbe writes in the book of Tanya that the most remarkable aspect of the entire story was the eagerness that Abraham demonstrated to carry out God's command, even while setting aside all of his personal feelings. Now, it's noteworthy that we call it the binding of Isaac, Akeda Yitzchak. We don't call it Nisayon Abraham, the test of Abraham. Why do we call it by the word the binding of Isaac? You know, when you look at the original commandment, when God tells Abraham what to do, he doesn't say bind him. He says bring him up as an offering. Binding is something that they did on their own. Why do we call it the binding of Isaac? The binding came about because Isaac says to his father, I'm afraid that when I see the knife coming at me, I'm going to shake. And if I shake, maybe it won't be a kosher shechita, it won't be a kosher slaughter. The offering won't be proper. So Tati, please bind me so that if we're doing this, let's do it right. This is what father and son are thinking about on the top of the mountain. If we're doing this, let's do it right. And so we call it the binding of Isaac. Look how far they went to fulfill a commandment of God. Their only concern was, let's do it right. I want to give you a little bit of a Hasidic understanding here. The Lubavitcher Rebbe in the Sikha asks the question when he speaks about the binding of Isaac. And he asks a question that many have asked. Have not countless thousands of Jews given their life rather than renounce their faith? Throughout all of history. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, lost their lives to defend the faith of the Jewish people. Bow or be killed. They chose to be killed. And the Rebbe continued that although some may answer that the willingness to sacrifice a child is far greater demonstration of a faith than to sacrifice yourself, nevertheless, the Rebbe said, we found that in history as well. The story of Hannah and her sons. We found in history where people gave up their children as well for their faith. So why is it this story that we make the model example when so many have done it throughout our history? You know, the story of Hannah. Hannah cries out after the death of her seventh child, and she says, my children, go to Abraham your father and say to him, you bound one offering upon the altar. I have bound 7 offerings. Furthermore, asks the Rebbe, while Abraham was prepared to sacrifice his son, he didn't. He was stopped. But in the thousands of Akeda and the thousands of sacrifices throughout our history, Jews actually gave up their lives and the lives of their entire families. And the Rebbe adds that unlike Abraham, God never spoke to them. God never came to them and said, this is what I need you to do for me. They did it out of the pureness of their emunah, of their faith, even though God was invisible to them, even though they may have had doubts about God's presence in their lives. In many instances, their self-sacrifice wasn't even over a cardinal principle of Judaism, and yet they showed Mesirat Nefesh. So why is it that we recite the binding of Isaac every single day, when it's clearly not the only demonstration of faith of the Jewish people throughout our history? And the Abarbanel writes in his commentary on the book of Bereshis that the Akeda must be forever on our lips, for in it lies the entire strength of the Jewish people and their merit before their heavenly Father. The Rebbe brings down the Abarbanel and again asks the question, why only the Akeda? What about the thousands who made the ultimate sacrifice of dying, al Kiddush Hashem, of dying for God's name? And the Rebbe asks one final question. Why weren't the tests that Abraham went through before Lech Lecha, before God appeared to him, before God spoke to him, before there was any communication from God, why weren't they considered greater than the ones after there was already a relationship? When Abraham was willing to give up his life by Nimrod to be thrown into a fiery furnace, wasn't that greater? God didn't speak to him. God didn't reveal himself to him. God didn't tell him he's going to be a great nation. And yet, he showed such loyalty. Now, the Rebbe gives a 2-part answer. In the first part, he gives a parable. Once there was a vast wilderness. There were no paths, trails, maps, information about the terrain. Along comes a man who pioneers the wilderness, and he cuts a path through its entire length. Many have followed his footsteps since it's still a difficult journey, but now they had a path to follow. They had a map to read. They had a guide to get through the wilderness. And over the years, there were some who made the journey in even more difficult conditions than the original pioneer. Perhaps the weather affected their journey more. They traveled by night, making it difficult to see the path. Nevertheless, all are forever indebted to the pioneer of the path, without whose efforts they never would have attempted the journey in the first place. Abraham was the pioneer of self-sacrifice. We have that strength. Our ancestors had that strength. Those who went through a Holocaust, those who went through all persecutions only had that strength to survive because Abraham did this. This is how it began. Because it was taken min hakoach el hapoel, it was put into actuality, not left in potential. Once Abraham went through this gene was put into our souls. Every one of us and our ancestors had the strength of Abraham within them because of this story. Hannah and our 7 sons, and any great story of powerful faith and inspiration only happened because there was a pioneer. That's why we read this story every day. Because the story tells us about ourselves, what we have within us, who we really are, what we're made of. And second, the Rebbe explains the binding of Isaac was uniquely different than the challenges of anything that came before and anything that came throughout history. For as we explained in our 5 dimensions, Abraham was not just asked by God for the sacrifice of life. He was asked for the sacrifice of self. When you have a belief that something is so important in life that I'm willing to die for it, it's noble and it's great. But many people can have that. And people of all faiths have shown that. You have principles that you're willing to die for. When Abraham stood before King Nimrod and said, I won't bow to you, it was a principle in life that Abraham felt was so important that he was willing to die for. Great, absolutely great. But nothing compared to the sacrifice of self. As we mentioned here, this went against everything that Abraham believed. It went against everything that he represented. It went against every aspect of his personality. He did it for one reason and one reason only. God asked him to. And what were the words after he does it? Ata yodaiti. Now I know ki yirei Elokim ata, that you have awe of God. Now I know that everything you've done before is only because I asked you. Not because you reached your own conclusion. Not because intellectually it made sense. But because you did it for me. The ultimate self. Quote on the word self. The sacrifice of self. And so, going back to our original question, if God knows the future, why put him through it? Of course God knew the future. God knew that Abraham would be willing to do it. Why did he put him through it? What was to be gained? A number of answers given by the classic commentators throughout our history. The first is that reward is given for action and deed, not potential. God wanted there to be a storehouse of reward for Abraham and all of his descendants throughout the rest of time. So that when we needed something to draw from, when our account was empty, when there was nothing left in our savings or checking account, when our credit line was used up, and yet we were in need, we can come to the shul in the morning, we can take out the prayer book, we read the story, and we say, Dear God, what I'm going to ask for today is not because I'm worthy. What I'm going to ask is, can I pull something out of my Zaydi's account? Reward is given for actuality, not what he had in potential. He went through it, and so the storehouse of reward was put there so that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the generation of Moses, and the generations of King David, and our generation, we would all have this merit that we live with because we're always going to have to draw from it. There's going to be tremendous reward for all generations to come because you did this. Maimonides explains that the main purpose of the binding of Isaac was that the nations of the world should become aware of Abraham's righteousness. He says the word yodaiti is haidaiti. I have now informed the world. So when they want to question, why did God choose the Jewish people? Do you know who their Zaydi was? Do you know what their Zaydi was willing to do for me? Flagpole. The banner on the top of the pole. This is a banner for the world to see, to understand the greatness of the patriarchs. The Abarbanel explains that it was not as much for the world to know about the greatness of Abraham, but for the Jewish people to know. We need to know our Zaidi. We needed to know who he was. We needed to know the strength of his amunah so that we try to take a part of that in our own daily lives, in our own struggles. When we decide to keep Shabbos and break a leg, when we decide to keep Shabbos and the storms keep coming, when we do any mitzvah and things don't automatically turn all beautiful and bright, that we have the strength to plow ahead. Says the Abarbanel, we read this story because we need it every day of our lives. I'll conclude with this. It is written in the portion of Bechukosai and also recited in the prayer that we say after the binding of Isaac. It says the following, V'zocharti es berisi Yaakov. God says, I will remember the covenant I made with Jacob. He talks about the time we're going to go away from God and we're going to sin and we're going to rebel and then we're going to come back. We're always going to come back. We're always going to return. The relationship is eternal. The Jewish people could never be shut down. And many of the lectures throughout this retreat, we're going to focus on that. God says, V'zacharti es berisi Yaakov. I will remember the covenant I made with Jacob. V'af es berisi Yitzchak, and also the covenant with Isaac. V'af es berisi Avraham Esker, and also the covenant I made with Abraham, I will remember. Did you follow that line? There's something wrong with the way I just said it. It's exactly as the Torah says it, but there's something a little bit off. I'll say it one more time. I will remember the covenant I made with Jacob, and also the covenant I made with Isaac, and the covenant I made with Abraham I will remember. The question is asked. He uses the word remember when he says Abraham's name. He uses the word remember when he says Jacob's name. When he says Isaac's name, he just says, and the covenant I made with Isaac. He doesn't say, I'll remember. Why doesn't he use the word memory when it comes to Isaac? Hey, play fair. You had 3 patriarchs. You're saying, Zachor, you're going to remember the covenant with Abraham. Zachor, you're going to remember the covenant with Jacob. Isaac, and the covenant I made with Isaac. Why does he just get an and? Why not I will remember? And the answer given, Rashi says, the reason he doesn't say remember by Isaac, because when we talk, we don't say remember about something that's right in front of us. I'm not going to say to you right now, I remember when I was standing here, there was a bottle of water. I can say that tomorrow. But right now, I can't say I will remember there's a bottle of water here. I say there is a bottle of water here. You don't use the word remember about something that's right in front of you. God doesn't use the word remember when it comes to Isaac, says Rashi, because the ashes of Isaac stay before God at all times. He never takes his eyes off it, so he doesn't use the word remember. You follow that? Abraham, he needs to remember. Jacob, he needs to remember. Isaac, he doesn't need to remember because the ashes stand right there in front of God's throne. What's the obvious question? Go ahead, shout it out, because it was bothering you when I said it. There were no ashes of Isaac. What do you mean the ashes of Isaac? He stopped him. We read this story. He stopped him. It didn't happen. Furthermore, it says that they knew, the Talmud in Zvachim says, they knew where the altar should be on the Temple Mount. How did they know exactly where the altar should be placed? Because they looked where the ashes of Isaac were, and that's where they built the altar. What ashes of Isaac? There were no ashes of Isaac. And the answer can be found, again, Rashi on the verse, when he talks about the ram was was offered tachas beno in the place of his son, that the ashes of the ram became the ashes of Isaac. It was as if it was Isaac because he held nothing back. There wasn't a little part of Abraham that was thinking, maybe not. He gave it completely. And therefore, those ashes were the ashes of Isaac. And God puts it before him at all times, because at every single day, at every single moment, at every single plea of every single Jew, of every descendant of Abraham and Isaac throughout history till this very day, when he hears our cries, when he hears our pleas, when he hears our tefillos, he's hearing it while seeing the ashes of Isaac before him at all times. So why is this story so important, so fundamental? Because it's part of our daily lives. It's part of every tefillah. It's part of every prayer that we recite to God. It's who we are. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our very essence. Abraham, our Zayda, is part of us. And what he did for God is what we did for God. Thank you very much.